Hello and good afternoon. I would like to welcome everyone to today's webinar, Restarting Global Travel During COVID-19, Considerations for Employers. Before we get started, I'd just like to go over a couple of housekeeping items. Just so you're aware, this webinar is being recorded and we will send you a link to download the recording after today's live session. We also encourage that you ask questions throughout the presentation. To do so, please use the question function that you see on the side of your screen. And so just to start off, for those of you who are not familiar with us, for nearly 20 years, Envoy has been on a mission to fix the inefficient, frustrating, and confusing immigration process. We combine a top-ranked legal team with innovative technology to deliver the only platform that makes it seamless for companies to hire, mobilize, and manage a global workforce. We secure work authorization in over 150 countries. We've grown 37% year over year, and we work with over 1,000 customers. We are particularly proud of our NPS score, which is a testament to the employee experience that we provide. And joining us today are three members of our global immigration team, the first being Hannah Inchan, the global immigration manager for EMEA here at Envoy. Hannah brings over 15 years of immigration experience to her current role. Hannah is a UK qualified solicitor and has served clients from startups to Fortune 500 companies through her work with internationally legal 500 recognized immigration law firms and the immigration team at a Big Four accounting firm. Nice to have you, Hannah.
Nice to be here, thank you.
Also with us today is Michelle Gong. Michelle is a global immigration manager based in San Francisco, and she covers LATAM and consular matters at Envoy. Michelle has a wealth of experience and a knowledge of global immigration and managed global programs for Fortune 500 corporate clients from all aspects, including strategic consultations, complex M&As, and immigration compliance pre-audits. Michelle previously served as an immigration manager at Berry, Appleman, and Leiden, and most recently at Facebook as a global immigration partner. Nice to have you, Michelle.
Thank you.
And last but not least, we'll also be hearing from Jim Yang. As a global mobility specialist at Envoy, Jim provides comprehensive policy consulting, case strategy, and compliance advice for Canadian immigration and has project experience with immigration process optimization. He has over 6 years of corporate immigration experience across multiple industries. Prior to joining Envoy, Jim worked in multinational immigration firms where he was responsible for managing the delivery of business immigration services for corporate accounts and consulted on all sorts of Canadian immigration matters. Nice to have you, Jim.
Thank you, Nidhi. Happy to be here.
Great. And so just to give you a quick overview of our agenda today, we will spend a couple of minutes covering the current COVID-19 situation and what that means for travel. We'll then dive into some region-specific considerations that employers should know about, followed by a brief audience Q&A. And just before we begin, I just want to let you guys all know that content in this presentation is not intended as legal advice, nor should it be relied on as such. For any additional information on the issues discussed, please consult your Envoy affiliated attorney or another qualified legal professional. Great. So as many of you know, the COVID-19 pandemic is still rapidly evolving, and we're seeing many countries seeing a second wave or spike following the initial outbreak this spring. As of now, we've seen over 18.2 million cases worldwide, and there have been reported over 264,000 deaths worldwide. Right now, the US is leading the globe in case counts, but other countries also are seeing spikes. Other countries are seeing a reduction in case count, which makes it a very unique time for travel because restrictions vary widely by the country. That being said, we're still seeing a huge impact on travel. Multiple metrics are showing air travel dropping as much as by 86% during the height of the pandemic in March and April. And Hannah, just to give you some background, what would you give as general advice about the, travel during this complicated time?
The one piece of advice I would want everyone to leave with, and I'm sure you've heard this many times, so as you can imagine, the travel and immigration landscape at the moment is changing rapidly on a weekly, if not on a daily basis. So we would strongly advise that all individuals check with your legal teams with regards to requirements, travel requirements and quarantine requirements before they travel, because we don't want a situation where an individual is at the airport and they can't get on the plane, or they arrive at the destination country and they're not permitted entry to that country. So please do check with your legal teams before you travel.
Great. Thanks so much, Hannah. Just a note before we get into the bulk of our presentation, this is being recorded remotely, so please excuse any issues with audio or visual quality. We are working hard to bring you a good broadcast, and we just wanted to make sure you're aware of that. Great. So Hannah, you as the Global Immigration Manager for EMEA, do you want to start things off by telling us a little more about what the travel situation looks like there?
Yeah, thank you, Nidhi. So the countries in the EMEA region, and that's the European, Middle East, and Africa region, have had varying responses to the rapid development of COVID-19. Many of the Middle East and African countries have closed their borders and have stopped processing applications for work permits and visas and residence permits, whereas many of the European countries have generally continued processing work permits and residence permits, although in the European countries, some have restricted travel. As you can imagine, travel restrictions and processes will vary in different countries. But what we are seeing is a general theme, is that authorities are utilizing online methods for submission. So one good example is in Germany, where previously, pre-COVID-19, work permit extension applications were submitted in person. You would book an appointment at the foreigner's office, the applicant would attend, and they would submit the application in person. But Germany have now moved away from that in-person appointment, and extension applications are now being submitted by email and or by post. There is still an in-person appointment, but that comes later down the line. So they're reducing the number of contacts that an applicant would have with a government authority. With regards to travel for business purposes, again, there are frequent changes to each country's entry policies. And like I mentioned before, please do check admission requirements before traveling. For example, we are expecting an announcement from the Irish authorities tomorrow regarding a potential travel ban on non-essential travel to Ireland. Ireland has remained relatively open up until now, and although the announcement hasn't yet been made, we are expecting the announcement tomorrow. And that announcement is expected to include residents from the US and from Brazil to be banned from entering Ireland for non-essential travel. So if we can move, sorry?
Sure, no problem.
Thank you. Moving on to the Schengen zone more specifically. So many of the Schengen countries have implemented a ban on non-essential travel. And like potentially with Ireland tomorrow, non-essential travel has been defined by many countries as a tourist or business visit. There are exceptions, like there is to many things in immigration. Many countries have adopted the European Union Commission's recommendation to allow residents from a number of countries to enter for non-essential travel, that being the exception. These countries include the UK and other EU countries. So, for example, a resident from the UK can travel to the Netherlands for non-essential travel, for a tourist visit, or go to Spain for a holiday. Other countries outside of the UK and the EU that are exempt also include Algeria, Australia, Canada, Georgia, Japan, Montenegro, Morocco, New Zealand, Rwanda, Serbia, South Korea, Thailand, Tunisia, and Uruguay. This list of countries is frequently being reviewed, so please do double check before travel. Additionally, not all EU countries have fully implemented the European Commission's recommendations. For example, the German authorities have continued to include Japan and South Korea on their list of banned countries. So there are exceptions to every rule. Before traveling to the Schengen area, please also double check the quarantine requirements, as each country and sometimes even each city has implemented different quarantine rules. So if we have a look more specifically at the UK have generally kept borders open throughout the last few months. So individuals who already hold a visa or do not need a visa can still enter the UK for business or tourist visits. Although during the peak of the UK's COVID-19 response, many of the visa application centres who issued visas did close. But what we are seeing is that many of them have now reopened. So the UK is starting to reopen in terms of issuing visas. And we are seeing that some centres have also started to re-offer the expedited processing service, where visas can be issued within 1 week instead of the usual 3 to 4 weeks. Additionally, the UK immigration authorities had implemented a number of temporary measures in response to flight restrictions out of the UK. So at one point, there were many airlines cancelled flights, which left a lot of foreign nationals stuck in the UK without being able to leave. So one example of this is where individuals who had residence permits expiring before the 31st of May were able to request a short extension to their permit, which would not have been normally allowed under the usual immigration rules. We are starting to see the UK's numbers of COVID-19 cases starting to fall. Well, they've been falling rapidly for the last few weeks. And as mentioned earlier, UK visa application centres have started to reopen. And what we are seeing is that in the UK, the biometric centres have also resumed service. However, there is a huge backlog of appointments after being closed for a number of weeks. In an attempt to manage the backlog of appointments, the UK immigration authorities are implementing a trial where they utilize fingerprints captured from an individual during a previous application to process the individual's current application. Not everyone is eligible. If the individual is eligible, they will be invited by the UK immigration authorities to participate in the trial. The trial is rolling out at the moment, and it is rolling out slowly. The initial indication emails have been sent out, but at the moment we don't have any further details as to when the process will happen. So the new trial requires the applicant to download the UK Immigration Authorities app into their smartphone. They would upload a photo of their face to the app, and the UK authorities would then process their application and and then issue the UK residence permit without the individual attending a biometric centre. That is a complete change from the previous process, where an individual were absolutely required to attend a biometric centre. So the UK authorities are again limiting contact with the authorities. The UK have continued to allow permit and visa holders to enter, as mentioned earlier, but they're also allowing permit holders and visa holders to leave and also re-enter the UK. However, there is a 14-day quarantine requirement when an individual enters the UK. There are exceptions to the quarantine requirements. For example, if the individual is returning from an exempt country, but this list of exempt countries has and very recently changed with very, very little notice. So again, please do double check before traveling. I'm going to move on to the Netherlands. As the Dutch authorities have implemented the EU Commission's recommendation regarding the ban on non-essential travel, which, as mentioned earlier, prevents individuals from non-exempt countries from traveling to the Netherlands. If an individual has a business travel, which is urgent and unavoidable, it might be possible to request approval from the border control team prior to travel to allow admission. However, the authorities are very, very strict about this, about issuing the approval, and they are very, very strict about what they would consider unavoidable travel. So approval is unlikely to be issued. The Dutch authorities have continued to process work permits throughout COVID-19, and however, many of the Dutch consulates and embassies have been closed. So consulates and embassies have started to resume. Sorry, some consulates and embassies have started to resume services, but there is a large backlog of appointments. Individuals who have a work permit and residence permit approval and do not need a visa to enter the Netherlands are now able to enter the Netherlands with a copy of their approval. This is a change from a few weeks ago where they wouldn't have been allowed to enter unless they had a valid residence permit. It is possible for the individual to leave and re-enter the Netherlands without obtaining the residence permit now. However, we do highly recommend that individuals obtain a residence permit prior to leaving the Netherlands. So, for example, if you had a US national who's recently had a work permit approval, they can enter the Netherlands with their work permit approval letter. They would be required to attend a biometric centre and request their residence permit. The residence permit will normally take about 2 weeks to be issued, but some individuals do need to travel prior to the residence permit being issued. We do not recommend this at this point in time. The Dutch authorities do not currently have a mandatory quarantine on arrival, but they do have a list of red and orange countries where quarantine is highly, highly recommended. We are starting to see the authorities becoming a little bit stricter about that requirement, or about this highly recommended quarantine. So it is highly recommended. I am going to move to South Africa, where South Africa's borders continue to remain closed as of today. And entry is granted to a limited number of individuals, including persons involved in the transportation of fuel, cargo, and goods, or South African nationals or permanent residents. There's a few other categories, but one interesting category that they've also included is the category where the South African authorities have stated individuals who demonstrate exceptional circumstances supporting their request for admission into South Africa. Permission will be required from the South African Department of Home Affairs prior to travel if they are coming into this category. And we have seen permission being granted to work visa holders who ordinarily reside in South Africa and were outside the country when borders were closed. As at the present, work permit holders who are not in South Africa cannot enter South Africa on their work permit. So the number of the categories of individuals who can enter South Africa is very, very limited. The South African consulates who usually issue work visas are presently not issuing any new work visas. And this includes both the Section 11.1, the 11.2, which is a short-term work authorization, and ICT work permits and general work permits. So it will be very, very difficult to get a visa to enter South Africa at the moment. whilst it is possible to leave South Africa if you hold a permit, work visa holders will find it difficult to return. So if they are in South Africa at the moment, we recommend that they don't travel. Individuals who are able to enter South Africa will be required to undertake a health screening at the airport, and they could be required to complete a mandatory quarantine. So that's it for the EMEA region, and I'll pass you back to Nidhi.
Wonderful. Thanks so much for those updates. On that note, why don't we move on and take a look at the LATAM region and see how the situation is unfolding there, which Michelle can speak further to.
Thanks, Nidhi. So within the LATAM, which is the Latin American region, there has been quite a standstill, and it's varying between country to country, allowing travelers to go. So we do see a range in the spectrum that have very strict travel bans to allowing individuals and foreign nationals to enter without any issues. We have been just seeing a bit of gradual reopening. It looks a bit softening for individuals to travel. So we definitely recommend, as Hannah's been saying, to check the country by country at real time, because things do move quite quickly.
Great.
And from Mexico, so speaking of like the spectrum of allowing individuals to enter or not enter with the travel bans, Mexico is definitely one of the countries within the region that allows foreign nationals to travel into the country and allows for business travel. So there is currently no restrictions for entry, re-entry, or exiting out of the country. The other attractive reason of traveling to Mexico is that there's no current quarantine period that's mandatory. However, if an individual is showing symptoms, or if there is a temperature check that is above the required requirement, then they will put a mandatory quarantine period for that individual. We have seen in Mexico as well that there is ramping up for the services provided from the immigration perspective. It is slow, but it is moving. So we are happy to see that for any in-country renewals, that it is moving along, as well as any kind of document procurement. We have seen quite a few requests for, like, for example, marriage certificates or birth certificates. Those offices are reopening, and we are able to move forward with those requests. And one of the things I did want to touch on, I know Hannah was mentioning about some countries moving more to online matter. However, for Mexico, there is still an in-person appointments required for the in-country immigration application. So we do want to flag that the offices are open and that individuals or applicants will need to appear in person. All right, let's go on to Colombia. So Colombia is towards the other end, whereas the borders remain closed until August 31st. The travel ban did start in mid-March, and the process of the travel ban has been extended all the way through the 31st of August. We have been seeing, we are monitoring how the authorities will reopen or extend out the travel ban. We have seen that nationals and residents of Colombia may re-enter. There is a quarantine period in Colombia. The other things that we did want to flag is that we know that individuals in Colombia may have a tourist status. They may have just arrived as tourist travelers. Initially, their extensions was up until, I believe, September. Now it's all the way through November 16th. So individuals may stay in Colombia and not have to be concerned about their in-country status. It has been blanketed approved until November 16th. So again, with Colombia, there is a travel ban, but they are allowing for individuals to exit, and for any individuals who hold their citizenship of that country, they're able to enter and return home. Right, back to you, Nidhi.
Great. Thank you so much for talking us through that and giving us a sense of what's going on in the LATAM region. Now let's go back to what the restrictions look like in APAC, which was, of course, originally the epicenter of the epidemic. Hannah, did you want to start on this?
Yes, thank you. Let's talk about China, where it all started. China's borders have been closed for many months, and they continue to be closed, except for diplomatic workers. And this means that no admission has been permitted even to holders of valid residence permits. The Chinese authorities, however, are making some changes, and they've been slowly implementing a special visa where companies are required to obtain a letter of invitation from the local immigration authorities in China. Once this letter has been issued, the individual then has to apply for an entry visa from the Chinese consulate or embassy in their home country or the country where they have residence. However, from experience, many of the local immigration offices appear to be reluctant to issue this letter of invitation. And the only authorities that appear to be flexible or more inclined to issue the letter of invitation are the authorities in Shanghai. And also the letter of invitation is only applicable to permit holders, to residence permit holders, or permit holders, to holders who have a valid residence permit but are not in China, and they're outside China and they're looking to get back in. This special visa is generally not applicable to any other category of individuals. However, having said that, again, sticking with individuals who have valid resident permits, a couple of days ago, on the 10th of August, the Chinese authorities did announce a concession to individuals who, like I said, hold a valid residence permit for China, but are not in China at the moment. So nationals from these countries, which are listed in the slide, will potentially be able to be granted an entry visa for free to enter China. However, this concession has just been announced, so many of the consulates are still in the process of implementing the issuance of these visas. We've been checking with the Chinese consulate in the UK, and unfortunately, the consulates in the UK have not really implemented this new visa, so it may take a few days or weeks for consulates to start issuing or implementing this new process. But for individuals, so foreign nationals who are in China, holding either a valid work permit and residence permit or a dependent permit, the Chinese authorities are continuing to process the applications, the extensions, or if you were changing from one employer to another in China, then they are continuing to process these applications. The issue is with regards to traveling into China. On arrival in China, individuals are required to complete a mandatory 14-day quarantine. So moving over to India, from the 27th of April, the Indian authorities restricted all commercial flights to and from India in their response to managing the spread of COVID-19. As such, only chartered flights, including diplomatic flights, were able to enter India. This meant it was difficult for anyone, including Indian nationals and visa holders, to actually enter India unless they were able to get to either charter their own flight or to get a seat on one of the specially chartered repatriated flights that Air India were operating. In addition to this, the Indian consulates and embassies around the world stopped their visa services. They stopped issuing visas at that point. However, in recent developments at the end of July, the Indian authorities confirmed that international commercial passenger travel, whilst remains restricted until the 31st of August, they have announced that there will be a relaxation in terms of entry and in terms of travel by way of what they call an air bubble scheme. This scheme is a bilateral agreement between India and the USA, UK, Germany, and France. The scheme permits certain visa holders to travel to India, for example, an employment visa holder or a holder of the OCI, the Overseas Citizen of India permit, to enter India on potentially a commercial flight. Further countries may be added to the scheme, but this will be at the discretion and the agreement of the Indian government and also the reciprocal government. Although these guidelines have been issued by the government of India, please do double check each country and also the airline, because they may also have their own set of rules and regulations. So as with the running theme of today's webinar, please do double check prior to travel. Under the present rules, all individuals entering India will need to quarantine for 14 days. There are exceptions to this rule, as recently announced. Potentially, travellers could apply for an exemption from the quarantine if they are returning to or they're travelling to India on one of the special repatriation flights that Air India are operating.
Great. Thank you so much, Hannah. Moving on to Singapore, Michelle, could you speak a little more to this country?
Sure. So with Singapore, we have been seeing the gradual border reopening to Singapore residents and long-term pass holders. Currently, short-term visitors are still not allowed entry unless there is a valid approval for entry from the authorities. So with the travel exemptions, there is an application that needs to be filed by either the employer or the applicant based on the type of status they have in Singapore to allow entry. There is also a mandatory quarantine either at a stay home notice or at their own accommodation or a dedicated facility. And this is contingent on where you have remained in the last 14 days prior to entry into Singapore. But we have been seeing slowly that there are approvals for applications filed outside of the country. We have also seen that there have been approvals for the travel exemption applications. So it is definitely on a positive spin where Singapore is definitely allowing slowly entry back into the country.
Great, awesome. And then to speak a little more about Australia.
Great. So Australia is definitely a country that is, it's very strict with the travel ban. So you cannot enter, re-enter, or exit. So we do have individuals that are stuck outside of the country that can't re-enter. They have valid work authorization. But in the meantime, for Australia, they are only allowing essential workers who have either an individual exemption or they're exempted based on their citizenship. So they're Australian citizens or holding permanent residence. And there's a list of those as well that would be exempted. One of the things that we do want to flag is that in order to be considered a critical sector individual exemption, there is an application that needs to be lodged through the company directly. And that does take some time. Usually we recommend to start that process at least 1 month prior, but they will not accept applications anything beyond, I believe, 3 months. So just being very mindful with the timing on that. And there is a 14-day mandatory quarantine, and there's also very limited in flights. So the travel ban is definitely strict, but the good news is that we are still able to lodge applications for in-country applicants as well as individuals who are offshore.
Great, thank you. And finally, that brings us to Canada. Jim, could you tell us a little more about sending talent into the country?
Yes, most definitely, Nidhi. So now in Canada, there are currently 2 travel ban orders currently in effect. The first is the Prohibition of Entry into Canada from the United States Order, or in short, we'll call it the Canada-US Order. Now, this travel ban was announced by Prime Minister Trudeau on March 18th and came into effect on March 21st. This order was last set to expire on July, but it was again extended for another 30 days, bringing the new expiry date of this travel ban to August 21st. Now, there's been a lot of media attention saying that that the Canadian government is in no rush of reopening the borders due to the current situation in the United States, and that we could see further extensions of this order for safety reasons. However, there is still a good chance that it might end soon as well due to the economic pressure. So we are monitoring this order on a daily basis. Now, at present, this Canada-US order essentially prohibits foreign nationals from entering into Canada from the United States for discretionary or optional purposes. Now, what this means is that a foreign national entering into Canada from the United States for non-essential reasons such as tourism, recreation, and discretionary business visitor activities will not be allowed entry. As a result, this travel ban applies to a vast majority of people entering from the US. With that being said, there is a handful of exemptions to this travel restriction. And before I forget as well, this order also does not apply to Canadian citizens or permanent residents, meaning that they are still allowed to enter into Canada if they are residing or entering from the US. Now, some exemptions to this travel ban include holders of Canadian work permits or study permits, immediate family members of a Canadian citizen or permanent resident, such as a spouse, child, or parent of a Canadian, passengers transiting through Canada, as well as providers of emergency services, such as medical professionals. Now, also exempt from this travel restriction are temporary foreign workers. However, this one is a little bit more complex. Now, when I refer to temporary foreign workers, I am referencing individuals that have been approved for a work permit but have not yet activated the work permit at the port of entry, or visa-exempt nationals from the US who are eligible to apply for a work permit at the border. Now, while IRCC has announced that temporary foreign workers are allowed entry, the reality is that you still need to demonstrate that your entry to Canada is for an essential and non-discretionary purpose. Now, the prohibition of entry into Canada from any other country other than the United States order, or in short, the international order, is very similar to the US version. The biggest difference is that this travel ban applies to all other countries besides the US and contains a more comprehensive but restrictive exemption list. This order is meant to prohibit foreign nationals from entering into Canada for discretionary purposes when coming from any other country besides the US, and it remains in effect until August 31st as of right now, with the possibility of it being renewed again closer to the end of the month. Now, similar to the Canada-US order, individuals exempt from this travel ban include current work permit or study permit holders, immediate family members of Canadians, and providers of emergency providers of licensed professionals. So I won't go into too much details on the entire exemption list, but some others include individuals who have been approved for permanent residence, individuals who have authorization from the Canadian consulate, and professionals invited by the government to assist in the COVID response are a few examples. Now, with respect to temporary foreign workers, it is the same as the Canada-US order with one major difference. Now, people that have been approved for a work permit and have the approval letter still need to demonstrate to a CBSA officer that their entry into Canada is essential and non-discretionary in order to get their official work permit at the port of entry. Where the difference comes in is for people that are visa exempt and can apply at the Canadian border for a work permit. So unlike the Canada-US order, where it's still possible for a foreign national coming from the US to apply for a work permit at the border using an application package, even though it's up to the discretion of the CBSA officer, IRCC has announced that no work permit applications will be adjudicated at the port of entry for temporary foreign workers coming from any other country besides the US, even if they're visa exempt. So for example, a UK citizen coming from London prior to this order is eligible to apply for an ICT work permit at the port of entry if they have an immigration package ready. Now, with this order in place, they are no longer eligible to do so, even if their work is considered essential. They will need to go through consular processing in order to apply for the work permit. Now, some might ask, if an individual has been approved for a work permit and is looking to enter into Canada to activate it, what are some scenarios in which a CBSA officer will deem their entry as optional or discretionary and ultimately prohibit their entry? So a good example where CBSA will most likely deem a foreign worker's entry as discretionary is if they have been approved for an open work permit but have not yet secured a job contract or offer, and is simply planning to search for work opportunities in Canada. Or if an foreign national or a foreign worker has been approved for an employer-specific work permit, but the business of their Canadian employer is currently closed due to the COVID outbreak. Now, with all these complex immigration regulations currently in place, one thing to keep in mind is that even though you might seem to qualify to enter into Canada under an exemption, you must have the appropriate documents to prove that you meet the eligibility. And I highly recommend speaking to a Canadian immigration lawyer or consultant prior to making any plans to ensure the chances of entry are, to ensure that the chances of entry are high. Now, because of the heightened security at the Canadian borders in response to the COVID environment, many of our government sources have confirmed that border officers will not hesitate to deny entry if they feel that your request to enter is not necessary at this time. So definitely connect with either your immigration providers or Envoy just as a precaution before having any employees travel to Canada during this time if they are needed. Now, lastly, Canada also has a mandatory quarantine order in effect. So if you're exempt from the travel restrictions, you must self-isolate for at least 14 days when you arrive. This applies even if you're a Canadian citizen or permanent resident. Now, to bring things to a close, I'm going to pass it back to you, Nidhi, to open up the floor for questions and talk about upcoming Envoy webinars.
Great. Thank you so much, Jim, really, and to all three of you for providing those updates. Yeah, so as Jim said, now in the interest of time, we will be quick, but just to let you guys know, we will take a couple of questions, and you can ask questions by using the box on the right-hand side of your screen. So we'll take a moment to just see if anything comes in. And just to let you guys know that we are unable to answer any case-specific questions, and for those, we do advise you to consult with your immigration counsel. And if you just give me a second, I just need to screen some of these questions just to make sure we can answer them. All right, so the first one that came in, and let me know if you guys are having a hard time answering this at all, but there's one question that came through. It's, are there any updates regarding travel to Egypt?
Not at the moment. But if you do send us the question by email, we can definitely look into it and get back to you.
Great. do have one coming in for Canada. So for Canada, how can a graduated student with an expired study permit and only the application letter for the postgraduate work permit possible be treated at the border if they've already accepted the offer letter? Jim, can you speak to that?
Yeah, most definitely. Sorry, Nate, can you repeat the question?
Sure, no problem. So the question is, how will a graduated student with an expired study permit and only the application letter for the postgraduate work permit be treated at the border if they have already accepted the offer letter?
Yeah, so if they've applied for a postgraduate work permit, it depends on the date that the approval was issued. Definitely check with Envoy or an immigration provider just to ensure that you are eligible to activate it at the border. There are some exemptions in place for certain individuals, depending if they're coming from the U.S. or any other country, to activate that work permit, but we'll definitely need to, see more details to assess if this would be something that is possible.
Great, thank you. And just in the interest of the time, we're going to do one last question, and then we'll close up the webinar. But the last question is: are there any updates regarding travel to Ireland?
We will, at the moment, Ireland is open for travellers. However, we are expecting an announcement tomorrow, which will potentially restrict a number of travellers for non-essential travel. So keep your eyes peeled. I'm sure we will be sending out a news alert if an announcement is made tomorrow. If not tomorrow, then it's likely going to be sometime next week. And we don't know exactly what's going to be in the announcement, but we are expecting some travel restrictions to be announced.
Great, thank you so much. On that note, I'm going to go ahead and wrap up. Once again, Jim, Hannah, and Michelle, thank you guys so much for your time. Just before we wrap up for the day, I just want to alert you guys to some of our upcoming webinars. So next Thursday, we will be providing an update on the new UK sponsor license system. That webinar will be taking place at 10 a.m. Central, 11 a.m. Eastern Time. And then on August 26th, we will also be having a webinar on the ins and outs of consular processing. So we hope you can join us for those as well. And as always, if you would like daily news and updates about immigration policy, trends, and important news to know, please make sure you follow us on social media and subscribe to the Envoy Immigration blog. Once again, thanks to all three of our presenters, and I hope everyone has a lovely afternoon.